Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alison Keith, and I'm the director of the Jackman Humanities Institute here at the U of T. I am so very pleased to welcome you, all of you, to the 4th Annual Jackman Lecture in the Humanities this afternoon. We instituted this lecture 3 years ago after the JHI reached 15 years of operation in order to recognize the generosity of our donor, the Honourable Henry N.R. Jackman. The Jackman Humanities Institute, now in our 18th year of operation, is the fortunate result of two very magnanimous donations by Hal, a former University of Toronto Chancellor. His donations were double matched by the university, creating an endowment to support research in the humanities and the humanistic social science disciplines at the University of Toronto. In fact, the JHI is a tri-campus endeavor with programming at all three of the university's locations and governance that includes deans from 10 divisions. Some might say we're overly governed. The heart of our activities each year revolves around an annual theme, and this year we're studying the theme of dystopia and trust, asking if widespread political and social trust can be achieved within and across societies, and if not, with what consequences. Before I begin with the introduction of our distinguished speaker this afternoon, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're gathering, the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. I want to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and commit myself and the Jackman Humanities Institute to walking the path of truth and reconciliation with them and their communities in the present. I also want to acknowledge the long history of broken treaties, forced migrations, and fraudulent agreements that has displaced Indigenous populations throughout Turtle Island. As we focus at the JHI this year on dystopia and trust, we must ask hard questions about our relationship to this land and to the political and institutional structures that continue to displace Indigenous populations from the University of Toronto and the City of Toronto. The Annual Jackman Lecture in the Humanities is one of the highlights of the year at the JHI, inaugurated, as I mentioned, 3 years ago. This lecture is an opportunity for us to celebrate the scholarship of our most distinguished colleagues in the humanities at the University of Toronto. And where better to turn than to our very own distinguished roster of Chancellor Jackman professors in the arts. And so I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished lecturer, Simon Coleman, Chancellor Henry N.R. Jackman University Professor of Religion at the University of Toronto. Professor Coleman joined the university in 2010 after 6 years at the University of Sussex, and before that, 11 years at the University of Durham. His research interests, as many of you will know, lie in the anthropology of religion, the globalization of Pentecostalism, the theory and ethnography of pilgrimage, contemporary ritual forms, urban religion, and religious infrastructures and urban development. He has conducted field work in Sweden, the UK, and Nigeria. He has authored or co-authored 7 books, and he has co-edited another 15. He was elected to the Royal Society of Canada in 2024 for his pioneering work in the development of both the anthropology of Christianity and the study of urban forms of religious expression. We're fortunate that his lecture today, I hope, will take up aspects of both. Please join me in welcoming Professor Simon Coleman, who will talk to us today about cathedrals, dinosaurs, and puzzling publics. There we go. On the importance of trivial religion. Professor Coleman.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Alison. And it just occurs to me, you can decide at the end of this lecture whether I've been talking about dystopia or trust or somewhere in between the two. We'll see. But it's also, of course, a great pleasure to contribute to this public lecture series. Am I mic'd? Yes, I don't. I think, James, can you mic me, or am I already mic'd?
Doesn't sound like it's on.
Okay. Yeah. It says.
It says you're on.
It says I'm on. Yeah.
I think you have to speak. You have to look at your notes. How would
Okay. I shall look at my notes as well as looking at everybody else. But I also wanted to say it really is a great pleasure to contribute to a lecture series that actually forms part of the work of the Jackman Humanities Institute. And I think in particular what's important about that is the way the Institute creates conversations at all levels of the university. And there are faculty here, there are also undergraduates in this room, and also, of course, conversations that reach beyond the university itself into Toronto. And so I want at the outset to thank Alison Keith, Kim Yates, Monica Toffoli and Sonia Johnson for all they've done in organising this event. But also I want to thank everybody in this room here for coming along, whether you're from this university or not, and joining the conversation. Now, as Alison mentioned, I'm an anthropologist of religion. By the way, while we're sorting out the sound, can you hear me at the back? You can't. So you can, but you can't. So I have to project in that direction. Okay, I shall start talking more loudly, and we'll see whether you can hear me. Okay. I'm an anthropologist of religion, most notably of two topics. There's the globalization of Pentecostalism, and on the one hand, and the efflorescence. Oh, okay. This makes it more dramatic. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to look at you in this now when I say, okay, I'm getting the thumbs up, thank you. So the globalization of Pentecostalism, but also the efflorescence of pilgrimage that's really been evident in many parts of the world in recent decades. And in fact, my point here is there are huge literatures on both of these topics now. But what I actually want to talk to you about today is actually a religious space and institution that's surprisingly enough, really very little has been written about it by people in my discipline, by anthropologists, and actually not that much by sociologists. It's a space, I would argue, that's been hidden in plain sight for anybody who actually wants to think about the role of religious or religious activity in the Euro-American world or indeed elsewhere. And of course, no surprises, the institution I'm talking about is the cathedral. Okay? And really, especially today, I'm going to be talking about the medieval English cathedral, the English cathedral that starts off in the medieval period and is still going today. Okay, so that's my theme. And now, admittedly, these are buildings that have proved endlessly fascinating to antiquarians, to archaeologists, to art historians, ecclesiastical historians, and so on. But with a few notable exceptions, not ethnographers, not people like me. It's as if their past is interesting, almost been of most interest, but really not so much the present, with the kind of exception, I would say, of heritage and tourism management. Now, you could say there are some good reasons why cathedrals might not seem very promising places for an anthropologist to study, even a specialist like me in Christianity. They lack the missionary dynamism of the kind of globalizing Pentecostalism that I've studied in Sweden and Nigeria, and has really helped to kick-start what we now think of as the subfield of the anthropology of Christianity. They also give a very good impression of being elite institutions, with little analytical purchase, therefore, for anybody interested in studying vernacular or popular forms of religious practice. They also seem, from certain perspectives, like deeply incoherent institutions, spatially, theologically, functionally. And what's worse, they often encourage the kind of fleeting encounters that don't appeal terribly much to ethnographers who are accustomed to prioritizing methodological tropes of depth and immersion. I mean, what can you do? Can you chase somebody out the door and say, talk to me for the next 3 hours, if they've been there? Now, they, and of course, worst of all, perhaps, they represent a religious tradition that appears to be, according to some people, appears to be disappearing into demographic and denominational irrelevance. I'm talking here of Anglican cathedrals, Church of England cathedrals. And we might think here of the British joke, I don't know whether it's travelled to Canada, where one person says to the other, "Are you religious? and that person replies, no, I'm Church of England. Okay? So why talk to you, therefore, about cathedrals? Why talk to you about Anglican cathedrals? Why talk to you about English Anglican cathedrals? Well, part of the answer does lie in my collaboration from 2015 to 2018 with colleagues from England in the project which I hope is going to appear up on our screen. Yes, Pilgrimage and England's Cathedrals Past and Present. And there you can see us trying to combine ethnographers with historians especially in trying to think about the shifting religious, cultural, material significance of three cathedrals. Canterbury on your left there, Durham in the middle, and York Minster on the right. Actually, I'm cheating. We did study 4 cathedrals. We also studied Westminster Cathedral, which is a completely fascinating Roman Catholic cathedral. But for the purposes of, I guess, coherence today, I'm not going to talk about that in my talk, but feel free to talk about it or ask me about it in the question time. Now, from that project, I began to realize that one of the fascinations of cathedrals for any anthropologist studying religion is that they can certainly work as pilgrimage shrines, but they can also, and at the same time, and you can see up here, work as civic spaces, heritage centres, performance venues, refuges from, but also extensions of the city, and so on. They're multi-layered and they're multivalent spaces. And that if we desire, if we actually want to look at them, they can help us to ask some questions, I think productive questions, of the kind that I've been interested in throughout my career. For instance, how do you think about ritual activity that blurs boundaries between participants and observers, between doers and watchers? And it involves what we often think of, or at least what I often think of, as a kind of anthropology of the encounter, where people are confronted with ritual forms that they're not necessarily familiar with, and they have to work out how to respond to them. Or indeed, what to make of religious performances, in turn, that blur other kinds of boundaries, including those between what Western scholarship has tended to refer to as public and private realms of worship and of religion. But I think there are 2 other reasons for talking about English Anglican cathedrals in the present. One, as I mentioned in the abstract to this talk, is that they've actually become extraordinarily popular places to visit, even in the context of an apparently dwindling and anachronistic Church of England. Let's see, and yeah, you can see some people, that's actually York being guided around that space. And this influx of kind of bodies into Anglican spaces both puzzles and intrigues Anglican administrators. And so what do we make of these buildings now full of bodies? And of course, this point also relates to my final reason for studying them and talking about them today, which was actually expressed very succinctly to me by Kim Yates, actually, in an email exchange that we had while planning this lecture. And Kim said to me, and she said, quote, "Everyone has had that experience of visiting a cathedral." So in the Jackman Humanities spirit of fostering conversation, I wanted to really talk about a space that I suspect almost all of us will have experienced, however fleetingly, whether in the UK or Canada or elsewhere. So I hope you don't mind, I'm going to have a quick experiment. How many people in this room have been to a cathedral? Put your hands up, please. Okay, it's pretty good. How many people have been to what I'm going to call a medieval British cathedral? Okay, wow, impressive. Okay, so yeah, you're the experts here as well, so good. So here's my first substantive section, which I'm calling Dinosaurs No More, ? So let's move to this first section and begin with the image of the cathedral not only as medieval, but also as dinosaur. And by the way, in parentheses, I can't just help mentioning that I think I'm right in saying that last year's Jackman Lecture was Tom Keemer talking about Jane Austen and the Jurassic. Is that right, Alison? Yeah. So yes, we are trying to take over the Institute and turn it into the Centre of Paleontology. And so this is our coup. But anyway, here goes. In 1996, the British sociologist of secularization, Steve Bruce, published a book called Religion in the Modern World, From Cathedrals to Cults. And the first chapter of that book really provided a kind of sociological lament on what Bruce called the great English cathedrals of the Middle Ages. And he built us, as he put it anyway, to glorify God by performing a rota of services that referred to a fixed annual church calendar, which are now given way to the cult, which he described as the emblem of religion for the 21st century. Now, we need to remember at this point that when Bruce talks about the modern world, this is an anthropologist talking about sociologists here, but when Bruce talks about the modern world, he seems largely referring to the Euro-American world, okay? And in any case, one of Bruce's sociological colleagues, Grace Davie, appeared to reinforce his conclusions in her description of the plight of English cathedrals in the recent past. She stated in a piece published in 2012, and I'm quoting her, "In the 1970s, these iconic buildings were frequently referred to as dinosaurs, large and useless." And actually, this is not strictly my remit, but when I was looking through the archives of Westminster Cathedral, there are minutes of a kind of a meeting there where some clergy are actually saying, "Let's knock down Westminster Cathedral. You know, it's so useless." But for Davie, what this meant, among other things, this idea of the cathedral as dinosaur, what it meant, among other things, was that the model of the territorially embedded state church, with, if you like, the assumed ecclesiastical and administrative authority of the cathedral, was running the risk of becoming moribund, unable to adapt to changing circumstances. Now, in fact, I would argue it's actually kind of worse in a certain sense than they say, in that you can say the English cathedral has appeared to be an anachronism, if not a dinosaur, for a much longer time than Bruce and Davie would say. Because after all, in the 16th century, the medieval English cathedral was forced to become something else, the post-Reformation cathedral. An institution whose increasingly anomalous character was demonstrated not only by the physical attacks of the 16th century dissolution, for instance, but also those of the 17th century English Civil War. And I can't help showing you this slide. Has anybody here heard of the Battle of Dunbar? Essentially, it's a battle where Cromwell defeats the Scots. And what does he do? He houses Scottish prisoners in Durham Cathedral. He decides it's an empty space, and it's almost as kind of, there are many interpretations of what he's doing, but there's a certain sense in which it's an act of sacrilege. Let's put these prisoners in this cathedral. And of course, what the prisoners do is they continue, in a sense, the work of iconoclasm. They continue to destroy the centre of the cathedral while they're there. But actually, it's not just these kind of physical dimensions. There's a kind of long theological and political debate about whether the idea of a Protestant cathedral was itself an oxymoron. And I can't help quoting a Calvinist critic. You always get the best quotes from Calvinist critics in the late 16th century, and he calls such buildings, and I quote, "dens of lazy, loitering lubbards, the very harbourers of all deceitful and time-serving hypocrites." And lubbards there, by the way, is from the same word. It's the same word as lubber, which means a clumsy person, so that's where we get landlubber from. Now, nearly 3.5 centuries later, in 1918, the Anglican polemicist Hensley Henson stated, and I quote, that the right use to be made of the cathedral foundations has long perplexed the bishop. So you think, well, fine, okay, that's a kind of fairly unexceptional remark, except that he made it just after he had been conferred Bishop of Hereford. Okay, so he's thinking, what on earth do I do with this building? More politely, but to the same effect, the ecclesiastical historian Dermot McCulloch recently claimed that post-Reformation cathedrals constituted fossils from a Catholic past that formed a liturgical fifth column inside the Protestant church. So all of that implies, I guess, that the cathedrals I'm going to discuss have actually been matter out of ecclesiastical place for a very long time, with their relationships to local parishes or national ecclesiastical or indeed secular governance never quite clear, and intimately subject to furious debates within the Church of England between more Catholic and more evangelical wings about what sacred space actually is. Now, given these confusions, we might expect, following Steve Bruce, that cathedrals are going to continue their downward evolutionary spiral, to continue that metaphor, becoming less and less adaptive, within a so-called competitive and increasingly segmented market of religious consumers. And incidentally, one where some clergy themselves suggest that the Church of England may cease to exist if demographic trends continue sometime later this century. Yet, all may not be lost. Grace Davie, Bruce's sociological colleague, goes on to make clear in her piece from 2012 that she was referring to her reference to cathedrals as dinosaurs was itself a characterization of the past, from indeed the 1970s, which I realise I'd say a good proportion of the people in this room will remember. Remember the 1970s? Yeah. She adds that in the present, constituencies for cathedrals are growing, consisting of both regular and less regular worshippers, as well as, quote, more transient communities of pilgrims and tourists. Indeed, one of the statistics that prompted our Pilgrimage in England's Cathedrals project came from a 2012 report revealing that 27% of adults resident in England had visited an Anglican cathedral at least once in the previous year. Okay, and I think it's worth just pausing on that. 27%, over a quarter of the resident population of the country. This is a report which has the amazingly resonant title, Spiritual Capital. And moreover, over 40% of these visitors came from faith traditions other than Christianity or had no religious affiliation. Nor were they confined to any one demographic group. In that report anyway, younger adults are vying with over 65s as the most assiduous visitors. Lower economic groups, socioeconomic groups are well represented, as well as higher ones. And I should say that actually when we did our research in the project that I was in, we actually tried to look, we did these very general, I think fairly crude surveys in the 3 cathedrals, and we found that actually most people would identify themselves as being white British, but in some of these cathedrals you've got about 10%, 15% of people identifying as South Asian. Okay. So something appears to be stirring with English cathedrals, one might say. But of course it might be argued with perfectly good justification that the popularity of English shrines under present conditions is largely an illustration of what the anthropologist Elaine Oliphant, who's drawing on Hannah Arendt, sees as the exercise, as she puts it, of a banal cultural privilege. What we might call an ambient and residual cultural framing of the urban environment, a Christian framing of the urban environment. We might equally see such popularity as illustrative of the physical accessibility and high cultural capital, yet relative liturgical impotence characteristic of many such sites. If you like, a liturgical impotence that's indicated further by the ethical dilemmas that impecunious cathedrals, who have to fund themselves, have faced in working out how far one can go semiotically, spiritually and economically in hiring out their prestigious spaces to possibly theologically and culturally dodgy events. Art exhibitions, silent discos. Leslie and I went to a silent disco. It's an extraordinary experience, if any of you have been to one. The filming of Harry Potter movies and so on. And yes, silent discos. This is taken from social media. You can see up here, we left the boys, this is going to Durham Cathedral, and we tried to spot Harry Potter in the cloisters. It's 20 years this year since the first Harry Potter book was published and so on. And Leslie and I had the extraordinary experience of wandering. We used to live in Durham. We had the extraordinary experience of wandering into Durham Cathedral, going through the west door and being confronted by a giant troll that was standing there because they'd left it from filming, I think, earlier that day. And yes, I did manage to find one. Norwich Cathedral. This is Dippy the dinosaur, who did a tour of England, including going to some cathedrals. I think she went to Coventry as well in 2021. But really, I don't think metaphors of ambiance or impotence quite tell the whole story. And really today, what I'm going to be trying to argue is that it's also important to ask what we should make of the public expressions, even displays of religion that cathedrals embody. Not despite, but in relation or adjacent to the presences of these apparently religiously uncommitted and possibly ritually unschooled populations. And in this regard, it's worth remembering that a cathedral like Durham offers over 1,400 worship services a year. And its chapter members insist, however dubiously, that all who come must be understood as pilgrims. So what's going on here, ritually, strategically, demographically, culturally? What to make of the often glancing encounters with cathedral rituals and cathedral spaces of diverse and transient flows of populations, or at least in the cathedrals I've studied, as people move in from, but also back to busy city streets, crowded city streets. And in exploring these questions, we'll eventually be in a position, I think, to consider the importance, eventually, of what I'm calling trivial religion, but also what I mean by the idea of cathedrals hosting publics that can be seen as puzzling publics. So let's pay a visit now together to a cathedral. So my next section is called A Benedictine Welcome. Imagine yourself set down in the northeast of England in the picturesque city of Durham. Exploring the centre, you move from the market square up a steep hill on Sadler Street before turning right to continue the short climb onto Palace Green. There's Palace Green, and you have to imagine castle here, cathedral there. At your back is Durham Castle, and ahead of you is the cathedral, both of them World Heritage Sites. You head for the great west door of the cathedral, excuse me, pass over a large mat that's marked welcome, and proceed down a short walkway, at the end of which an elderly volunteer, dressed in an impressive purple robe, says, "Morning, welcome to Durham Cathedral. Is this your first visit?" before handing you a purple book token decorated with a professional-looking logo. At this point, you're prompted to turn left to face the east of the building. And by looking down the cathedral's nave, you orient yourself towards the distant altar, and by going down into the cathedral, you soon encounter a raised feretory containing the remains of St. Cuthbert, who is Durham's #1 saint. Merely by coming this far, you participated in a carefully planned introduction to the building, the result of sometimes forceful debates amongst clergy and staff about the character, the ontology, and the purpose of the space, expressing all those ambivalences about materiality and about governance that I mentioned earlier. Importantly, of course, you haven't been charged for access, which is a matter of great pride to Durham and a distinction between it and its great northern rival, York Minster, as well as its southern counterpart, Canterbury. In the language of heritage management, you've been exposed to the site's wow factor, a term referring to the way in which a visitor's initial visual encounter with a site is framed to create an immediate sense of awe. And so I don't know whether people recognize this. It's also often meant to make you look up as you come in. But in turn, in the language of ecclesiology, you've been subjected to a version of the Benedictine welcome, a phrase increasingly used by English cathedrals and one that points very broadly to the idea of a monastic heritage of hosting while hinting at a modern brand identity. Note that despite being guided in, you haven't been asked about your specific intentions, and many options are now available to you. A wander around the building, followed by perhaps a personal prayer in a side chapel. An examination of a temporary art exhibition, likely to be located in a convenient corner of a transept. Maybe lighting a candle at one of the many stands dotted around the space. Or attending a small service at the feretory, beside the tomb of St. Cuthbert. Or going to Evensong. Or paying a visit to the cathedral's new museum called Open Treasure, where you do have to pay an entrance fee. Or simply making a trip down into the crypt, where the cafe and gift shop are located. And I should have had a picture of this, that one of the most successful things in that area is a Lego construction of Durham, and you pay, I don't know, a £1 or something to put an extra brick into that construction. My theory is that they actually take away the bricks overnight. So anyway, of course, in facing this array of options, you might be a local who comes every day or each week, but it's equally or more likely that you've rarely been there or never been there before. Now, the kind of variety that Durham offers is no exception, at least amongst the larger ancient urban cathedrals in the UK and to some degree elsewhere in Europe. The inside of a grand cathedral is a site of religious practice, but also of display, of the material culture of the place alongside professional performances of choirs, polished sermons, pilgrimage processions. But some forms of display are more subtly articulated, less overtly marked for external consumption, as the uninitiated take the opportunity to observe regular and practiced worshippers, say during a communion service, or as a casual visitor spies someone engaged in deep prayer in a side chapel. Grace Davie, whom we encountered earlier, sees cathedrals as obvious exemplars of what she calls vicarious religion, with worship being visibly and publicly offered on behalf of ever-widening groups of people who feel they lack the knowledge or confidence to participate. But while official performances conjoined with these passive forms of viewing do undoubtedly, provide important dimensions of cathedral life, in my view, that metaphor of vicariousness doesn't really fully capture the array of activities, modes of ritual address, and spatio-temporal framings of gatherings that are made available. Vicariousness emphasizes separation between liturgical experts and others. But as I'll be discussing in more detail in a bit, I think engagements with cathedrals can afford more complex forms of proximity to and even oblique, or what I want to call lateral participation in official and marked forms of ritual, and indeed ritual space. Now notice that term lateral. And I should say that my use of the term lateral is, amongst other things, a deliberate sideways step from the more conventional anthropological and sociological concept of liminality, which is still really in much use in and beyond anthropologies of religion. And that's a term that has tended to emphasize the ritual power of inhabiting a fragile, demarcated realm of religious experience that tends to imply both intensity of immersion and the possibility of setting up temporal, spatial, and behavioral boundaries from everyday activities. And that in many ways is what cathedrals are trying to encourage amongst many of their visitors. In my terms, laterality may also possess certain subjunctive qualities, but it also enacts much more of a sense of reaching ambiguously across spaces, times, and behaviors, prompting negotiations, intersections, articulations between behavioral frames that aren't necessarily hierarchically organized in any systematic way, and that may therefore thrive precisely on the scale and the relative incoherence of cathedral space, allowing people to remain one temporal or spatial remove from the centres of liturgical action, and indeed away from direct ecclesiastical surveillance. What interests me then about the idea of laterality involves the way it might involve and indeed acknowledge the sheer varieties of scale, modes of address, materialities on offer in a cathedral, and encourage multiple tonalities of engagement experienced on the part of those who encounter ritual in almost accidental or serendipitous fashion, as they move between observation of and practicing prayer, decide how to approach the tomb of a saint, perhaps even participate vaguely in a procession. In a curious sense, the term gains analytical purchase through its contrast with a tendency in some ritual theory, at least I think that derived from Western Christian understandings of religion, to emphasize the importance of heightened, earnest, repeatable forms of ritual engagement as a default model. So what I propose in my continued exploration with you of cathedral space is to draw on theoretical models to complement this depiction of laterality, and in doing so encompass fluid, often glancing, adjacent encounters with other ritual forms. And for these purposes, I find actually theories of urban encounter, theories of the city, to be incredibly useful in trying to reframe analyses of cathedral ritual. Not least because they incorporate, of course, a dimension of cathedrals that I barely mentioned so far, that they are also city spaces. Okay? And forming what one geographer, Veronica Della Dora, has called infrasecular geographies, that, as she puts it, pertain to the chronic making and unmaking and remaking of urban sacred space. The point here is fluidity. So in presenting you with some specific ethnographic examples from cathedrals, I'm going to read their performance shape-shifting through urban social theory that has no direct relationship at all with religion, and yet I think can provide a useful way to capture the multiple cadences, the social frames, the material encounters afforded by such buildings. And for the purposes of today, I'm going to take inspiration from one particular book, which has, I think, a wonderful title, Loose Space: Possibility and Diversity in Urban Life, by two geographers, Karen Frank and Quentin Stevens. And what they do in this book is to talk about how cities, of course, are composed of a great variety of place types. And what they call tighter, more constraining ones include, say, things like offices or libraries where behavioural norms are constraining and surveillance is evident. But of course, much public and civic space involves expectations that are less exclusive, more fluid, often gaining their identity through their relationships with other kinds of contexts, working through porous edges that allow people to observe or even straddle thresholds. The roots of Frank's and Stevens' perspective emerge, as some of you may recognise, from numerous theorists of the city, ranging from Zimmel to Sennett to Goffman to Lefebvre. But for my purposes, they express well the tensions, the ambiguities, the complexities that manifest around cathedrals as multiply framed and multiply claimed spaces of behavioural fragmentation, of adjacency and articulation, in equally complex relationships to cities around them. We might say, in fact, that over time, cathedrals house both tight and loose spaces in various combinations, and indeed calibrations, sometimes encouraging more liminal anti-structural behaviours that require the creation of tight boundaries around them in spatial and temporal terms, at other times affording much more ambiguously and loosely articulated behaviours that we might call lateral, as a visitor moves in and out of the rhythms and spaces of conventional liturgy, falling into or taking advantages of proximities to and partial overlaps with conventional ritual forms. Just to give you a few spaces, imagine entering those spaces and what you might do. Now, on a given day, a cathedral might host, of course, hundreds of visitors of many or no religions before staging a communion or prayer service, before accommodating an unexpected or sometimes an expected pilgrimage group whose members may range from the devout to the deeply sceptical. And that, by the way, our surveys, our very crude surveys, really just found that about half of people who are coming into cathedrals are coming as family groups. Behavioural looseness and tightness may be occurring simultaneously in different parts of the cathedral, but at times the whole space may shift serially from one to the other. For instance, as evensong, nowadays the most prominent daily ritual set piece of many cathedrals, is about to begin. To be sure, the choreographing of such shifts by cathedral staff may, if clumsily handled, provide a jolting experience, as loose turns quickly to tight. The following, for instance, are the comments of a volunteer at one Anglican cathedral as she reflects on the setting up of red ropes by cathedral staff just before evensong to restrict physical access to spaces near the main altar. I mean, this ended up as being a kind of almost an anthropology of red ropes as well. And she says to us, and that rope business in general, several people have asked why the ropes go up already 30 minutes before the service, thus blocking the way to the ferretry. Some question the need for ropes at all. Why not let everybody in during the service so that they can see there are no magic rituals going on? What she's criticising here is the assertion of a kind of liturgical proprietorship expressed in policing actions, as she thinks it, as that behaviourally and spatially distant spectators from what she sees as the overly uptight liturgical event, in effect denying the possibilities of either vicarious viewing or participation from a distance. The differentiated activities that occur in and around cathedral space may also permit the temporary overlaying of a tighter frame over a looser one. See if anybody recognises this experience. An example is provided at York Minster, where the milling around of tourists is interrupted on the hour by a loudspeaker that reaches into all parts of the building and asks everybody to remain still and remember, quote, that this is a place of prayer and pilgrimage. And the choreography involved is far more casual than that required to set up evensong. But unlike a formal service, it reaches into all parts of the space, requiring every visitor of the reminding every visitor of the regular rhythm of liturgical time and etiquette. And at this point, there's much hushing of kids and grabbing them so that they're not rushing all over the place. The response required of everybody to acknowledge the ultimate proprietorship of the church over this space comes close to a form of very broad ritual participation, however passive, uncomprehending and brief, and one that exists for the unsuspecting visitor on a sometimes uneasy continuum between the optional and the obligatory. But one area where the right balance of looseness and relative lack of official surveillance begins to move more clearly towards the lateral regularly occurs through a particular genre of activity that has itself formed part of the revival of popularity of cathedrals. While all of the cathedrals in our study helped put on formal pilgrimage events linked to the church calendar, such as, for example, the St. Cuthbert's Day Walk and Procession in Durham. And here you can see the St. Cuthbert's Day Walk with a couple of kind of medieval figures in front going from the town square. They're going up the hill and they're going up towards the cathedral there. This is involving this public procession. But cathedrals have also begun to have hire dedicated staff whose role is to respond to requests for the holding of much more personalised group pilgrimages. And these latter events draw on officially sanctioned church resources, yet are sometimes responding to, say, a family or a parish anniversary, the visit of a faith group that may or may not be Anglican, a visiting choir from abroad, and so on. And in the following, an Anglican religious professional working at one of our cathedrals discusses how her work has involved developing strategies to organise such pilgrims, including leading groups through the building while trying to remain sensitive to their needs. So on this occasion, she's reflecting on designing a candlelit pilgrimage, which is actually held after the building is officially closed. She says, I try as we go round, I say, if you've clearly made Christian profession of faith, you might like to think about this. If you haven't, you might like to think about something which is, I guess, less Christian language, but may actually end up being the same thing, really. So we start at the back, and then we literally journey. And so before I took a group round on my own, I spent some time thinking, how does the building speak of a Christian journey of faith? How can I use the building in different places to make myself a route? Now, the route that this woman describes is not one that seems meaningful to her. It's not only one, I should say, that seems meaningful to her. As she remarks elsewhere, she allows spirituality to prevail a little over historical detail. But she also uses each part of the fabric of the building to make broadly theological points, which is a function that cathedrals have always performed, albeit in different ways. For her, the nave prompts talk of the almightiness of God. The arches are presented as marking one space from another, and so give a sense of being in sacred space and so on. So this then is an ambulatory ritual meant to direct movement through architectural, historical and theological space without closing such movement into too tight a liturgical frame. Part of the point is to allow the occasion to speak through different registers simultaneously. And a notable juncture in the woman's description comes when she remarks that we go down to the crypt and in the centre of the undercroft we stop just to be quiet. So that's the longest place we stop, really, just to let people be still in the presence of God. The significance of this action as the longest, though not the last, component of the tour is striking. It allows for reflection, inchoately expressed at least to others, at a point a little away from the main shrine to the saint, as well as the main altar, partaking of, but not fully immersed in, the central liturgical focal points of the building. And this, in my terms, is beginning to inhabit a lateral realm of ritual action. But other activities bypass the need for any staff involvement, such as the almost ubiquitous lighting of candles. And whereas in Roman Catholic Westminster Cathedral, candles are usually placed in chapels or often directly in front of saints and martyrs, in Anglican cathedrals the placing of candles is much more theologically loaded. You don't want to put one usually in front of a saint. And stands tend to be placed in front of blank walls or columns. encouraging the use of candles, but leaving the precise recipient of the associated prayer or request often ambiguous, although in Durham they are actually placed by St. Cuthbert and St. Bede's. But we might compare such practices with the following exchange that I observed in front of a candle stand placed in front of the nave of Durham Cathedral, and which I've also analysed elsewhere. So here are what my fieldwork notes state. This is quite small script, but I'll read it out for you. And I'm essentially looking at, sitting at a bench. A father and young sons, two young sons, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, come to this candle stand. Older boy to father, "Dada, can we do that?" Father explains what to do with the candle, and they light it. And the boy blows his candle. "Father, you've blown out somebody else's, and you've got to put money in. Did you think about that? And you've got to write a prayer." Younger boy goes to the other side of the bench where I'm sitting. "I'm going to write it from over here." Older boy, "Is it like a wish?" Younger boy shifts position, so he's kneeling on the ground, using the bench as a writing table, almost a position of prayer. Older boy, "Daddy, I've done it." Father, "You're only meant to do one." Father to the younger boy, "All done?" Younger boy, "Where should we put it?" Father looks at the boy's note, tells him to put it in the basket. And then the father says, "Okay, boys, let's go." I look at one of the notes that's lying in the basket, and it says, "To Grandmother Gren," with a simple picture of a human figure sitting next to it. Now, I present this incident in detail with all its ethnographic question marks, because I think it reveals the negotiated quality of such deeply improvised ritual, but also because it indicates how such a scenario plays on many of the ambiguities and potential articulations I've mentioned so far. The exchange conjoining prayer and lighting a candle, occurring during a loose, really non-liturgically marked period of the day, plays out a small drama of kinship relations, mediated through a generic echo of formal rituals carried out by professional clergy. The father is originally drawn to the candlestand by his sons, but he then swiftly begins to negotiate what, in semiotic terms, becomes a form of joint attention. Though in another theoretical register, you might think of J.Z. Smith's notion of ritual as focusing lens. There's a hint of initiation about the scene, but in contrast to classic liminal activity, the actions are barely separated from the movements of wider publics passing through the space. And in turn, these transactions take place in a relatively ill-defined part of the cathedral. The candlestand is adjacent to the nave, on the way to, but separate from, both the main altar and the elevated shrine to St. Cuthbert, which is the prime object of pilgrimage. This nave is an exposed and widely accessible area, but the placing of the candlestand allows a smaller, transient circle of sociability to be created by the family group. And just as I note the distant echo of formal ritual evident here, so I point very, gently to the hint of a transposition between domestic and cathedral behaviours. The older boy's "Is it like a wish?" may refer not only to prayer, but to the lighting of a candle on a birthday cake, with his question representing an attempt to construe what's happening through the memory of a more familiar event. We can see a rich combination of actions combined with different deployments of language, restricted and elaborated codes, questions and answers and explanations, suggestions of making a prayer or expressing a wish, all necessary to a performance that's also a form of learning. Now, considering its improvised, low-key, highly evanescent, even porous quality located to the side of liturgically marked space, I take this interaction to be much more lateral than liminal. This is just one example of how the scale and relative anonymity of cathedral buildings provide spatial and temporal affordances for bricolage-like engagements, allowing ritual, spatial and ideological calibrations to occur within these flexible behavioural rhythms of the building. And my final case for now is provided by a middle-aged family man, a Methodist whom I call David, whose home congregation is located about 30 kilometres away from Canterbury Cathedral. He's well acquainted with the cathedral as he goes there 4 or 5 times a year. And he responds in the following way when asked what he thinks of the building. He says, "It's a combination. I think it's certainly a working church. I have friends in the diocese office here, and I know the work they do. For me, it's a spiritual place to come. Because this is not my home church, I enjoy the spiritual presence that's here. I'm intrigued by pilgrimages. Now, during his conversation, David describes the cathedral as having many functions that coexist, some of which he prioritizes over others. And pilgrimage emerges in his description in dialogue with other activities with which it's adjacent. I think there's no simple ethnographic answer to the question of whether David's regular visits to the cathedral could be classified as pilgrimages. But this particular occasion does form part of a ritual disposition to make regular visits to specific pilgrimage shrines around the country that he sees as representing part of his spiritual biography. In his terms, pilgrimage-like cathedral visits are complementary to his Methodist congregational attachment. And then, when David's asked if he's drawn to any particular part of Canterbury Cathedral, he's ready with a response. There's this little prayer chapel, the Martyrdom Chapel, because as you walk by, it's quite dark in the sense, but a light inside. So it's quiet, and because there's a sign saying it's reserved for prayer, people tend to respect that and they don't come in talking. So for me, I can go there and I can be silent in it. And that's a place that drew me. Now, this expresses a familiar trope in our work, of cathedrals being capacious enough to entail constant awareness of, but distance from, other members of the public. In this case, David's liturgical competence and self-consciousness contrast with the halting behavioural quality of the Father and the Son working out how to light candles. He strategically draws himself to the side of the actions and others, creating a semi-improvised frame of ritual practice that's adjacent to, and possibly even echoes, those of others as they worship, but is still separated from them, inhabiting a realm of laterality that expresses an evident, if benign, friction with the actions of tourists, more obvious pilgrims, and indeed conventional clergy. So now we've sampled some cathedrals, we've looked at some spaces, and in the final two parts of what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to start by addressing a couple of the questions that my title asks. So we're going to start off with trivial religion. Why trivial religion? The word trivial derives from a Latin compound where tri refers to three and via refers to road, implying a meeting point, a place of encounter that's relatively ordinary, yet requires decisions as to direction of movement from a given point. It therefore links to a spatial metaphor, and in its semantic associations with the easily overlooked or readily discounted, combined with its etymological links to varieties of obliqueness from a central point, it provides a useful complement to my discussions of laterality and to my underlying argument that we need a more nuanced vocabulary and observational methodology to be able to comprehend how such contemporary ritual forms may take their energy not only through being distinguished from other activities and sensibilities, but also through remaining in complex and ongoing spatial proximity to them. Behind this argument are many theoretical traces that I haven't been able to make explicit, including many to ritual theory. But I do want to emphasize that what I've been describing doesn't fit readily into sociological slots like the spiritual but not religious, or even necessarily the older vocabulary of implicit religion. Since the lateral engagements I've begun to describe entail encounters, however unplanned or evanescent, with spaces and rituals associated with public centres of Christian worship and identity. So this metaphor, sorry about my very basic physics diagram, this metaphor of a kind of refraction in relation to more official forms of ritual is meant to point to the behavioural limits of often barely discernible ritual involvement with such centres. For the examples that we've seen so far, laterality may be expressed in lighting a candle in a stand placed within sight of but not next to a saint's tomb, or in choosing to pray in a side chapel while remaining aware that other forms of worship are occurring nearby, or in encouraging an internally highly differentiated pilgrimage group to spend time reflecting in an undercroft rather than at an altar. What unites such behaviours is the way they permit openly ritualised stances to rub along with other frames of action, just as they can be both intimate and public at the same time, or as they permit relatively tighter behaviours to merge or blend into looser ones. They permitted me to discuss ritual engagements less through the totalising frame of the liminal, rather more through the restless, shifting, indexical, and often serendipitous realm of the lateral. But we shouldn't by default associate the latter with lack of social or material consequence, which is a point I think, for instance, David would make with some force. But if you can posit that cathedrals are no longer ecclesiastical dinosaurs, in part because of their capacity to house ritual behaviours that are trivial yet potentially socially consequential, we're still left, of course, with my final question, which forms part of the title of my final section as well as of this talk. Why puzzling publics? So, contemporary English cathedrals are probably best known nowadays for their capacity to stage great public events. The professionalism of hosting evensong can be scaled up to mark a notable funeral, a civic speech, or the avalanche of corporate carol services that are demanded by businesses and viewed with a certain amount of irony by clerical staff who are often more interested in promoting Advent. But the thrust of what I've said so far has been to suggest that cathedrals have shed their dinosaur status not only through making concessions to the business of Christmas or to heritage or to the civic realm, but also by affording and encompassing ritual acts and religious behaviours that flourish not only through their obliqueness but also through their capacity to remain relatively intimate even in public. And in this sense, the averted gaze of clerical staff can be as powerful in promoting ritual engagement as the appraising one. But I think there is an important twist to this argument, and it can't be ignored, though I'm going to mention it very briefly as I come to the end. Remember, we began with a reference to a Church of England relatively confident in its historical continuity, actually however contested that continuity might be, yet at the same time deeply unsure of its capacity for self-reproduction. Indeed, a candidate for dissolution, not through the 1,000 cuts of iconoclasts or opponents of women priests or indeed opponents of a female archbishop, but the far more dangerous threat, arguably, of apathy and literal emptiness. This is one of the reasons why the presence of so many visitors regularly flowing into cathedrals appears both puzzling and tantalising to administrators at various levels of the Church of England. It's therefore worth noting in conclusion that the Benedictine welcome, that generously classifies all visitors as pilgrims and doesn't look too hard at what they do, is nonetheless accompanied by a more regular and systematic gaze, or at least as systematic as the Church of England can make it, involving the collecting of figures. A biopolitical, you can see there cathedral statistics and as well as the spiritual capital report. This is an annual biopolitical accounting of all who visit. This is the form that gets sent round to each cathedral. You can't read it from where you are. And actually, it's a very interesting document because there are actually huge gaps. For instance, not really trying to trace the ethnic or denominational affiliations of visitors, just simply finding out presence or absence in the cathedral. Do they pay or don't they pay? Do they go to services or not? Now, I think in thinking about this biopolitical accumulation, we might be reminded, for instance, of Mikhail Kravl-Tovie's work on self-quantification, evident amongst American Jews, for whom the question, how many of us are there, becomes a form of enumeration rooted in anxiety over reproduction, but also the process of counting itself. And I also think of work I'm currently doing with my colleague Nadia Kaidi, looking at how the travelling pilgrim body becomes chronically subject to algorithmic and other forms of digital surveillance. But one of the beauties of the contemporary Anglican cathedral, as both ritual host and record keeper, may at least currently be, that it can bring so many of us into its purview without asking too precisely who we or us might be. So perhaps, after all, some publics are best kept at least a little bit puzzling. Thank you.